Hi everyone. In this video, we'll cover some of the basics of scenario planning, and I'm even going to take you through a self-paced scenario planning exercise of your own, a mini scenario plan if you like. If you haven't already downloaded the worksheet for this exercise and this series of videos, I recommend that you pause the video now and go and do that. As we both work our way through the exercise, just pause the video to do your parts and then resume when you're done. Let's get started. So what is scenario planning? I'll start with this quote, which seems a little long, but it's a great quote from Wilkinson and Coopers. And we'll unpack some of that as we go. Scenario planning has never really been about predicting the future. Its value lies in how scenarios are embedded in and provide vital links between organizational processes such as strategy making, innovation, risk management, public affairs, and leadership development. It has helped break the habit ingrained in most corporate planning of assuming that the future will look much like the present. As unthreatening stories, scenarios enable executives to open their minds to previously inconceivable or imperceptible developments. Scenario planners develop multiple stories or scenarios about how the future might unfold and use them to make decisions. Scenarios are what-if questions about what the future might look like based on forces that could shape it. Scenarios are not projections. We already covered that before. They're not predictions or forecasts. What they are powerful narratives to help you anticipate and prepare for the possible changes in future that you might encounter or that your organization might encounter. As Hawken, Ogilvy and Schwartz noted in their early scenario book called Seven Tomorrows, the aim of scenarios is to project alternative futures so that responsible and intelligent choice is possible. Scenario planning recognizes that we live in a really uncertain world and that we are limited in our ability to control or predict the future. And it works with that uncertainty by considering how issues might develop along different pathways. A pretty famous scenario planner, Pierre Vark, noted that scenario planning can serve you in two main ways. First, it can help you anticipate and understand your risk exposure. Second, it can help you by identifying strategic options of which you are currently unaware. Scenarios help to unearth both challenges and opportunities that may emerge in future to help you perceive change emerging over the horizon that you can't yet see, identify early warning signals, to help you prepare for what otherwise might have surprised you, and to help you communicate all of that with important stakeholders. Scenario planning is really useful for any organizations that face high uncertainty, have already experienced costly surprises, that find it difficult to generate opportunities, that are bureaucratic, that exist in a changing industry, or those whose competitors are already using scenario planning. Scenario planning links your organization to the future. How does it do that, you might ask? By making you think about what would be required in a range of plausible scenarios and comparing those requirements to current resources, capabilities, operations, policies, strategies, and administrative practices. Scenario planning also links the future to the present by enabling you to situate shorter-term strategies within longer-term scenarios to see how they might play out, to see how your current strategies measure up. If your organization has a strategic plan in place, then it is already considering and preparing for at least one scenario. The question is, how much more resilient could your organization become if it prepared for other possible scenarios? It would likely become significantly more resilient. The use of scenario planning dates back to the 16th century, when Louis de Molina and his contemporaries considered that the future may not be predetermined. It may not be a singular path, but rather it might be a set of what he called, or what they called, futurables. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, a group of people at Royal Dutch Shell developed and experimented with scenario planning in great detail. This famously led the company to anticipate and prepare for potential opportunities and threats, including the 1970s oil crisis and the 1980s Iran-Iraq conflict. Interestingly, in the 1990s, Shell's scenario planning efforts recognized that climate change threats were emerging, and this led to climate change being acknowledged in its 1998 sustainability report. Many companies have followed the lead of early scenario planners, and today it's an integral element of many company strategy making processes. A global survey of over 8,500 executives that is regularly done by Bain & Company showed that the use of scenario planning and contingency planning nearly doubled after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and that 65% of companies studied were expecting to use scenario planning or contingency planning in the near future. In summary, scenario planning generates better thinking about the future. So how do you do it? Let's take a look at the method. The scenario planning method I've developed has 4 main steps as illustrated on this slide. Each step contains sub-steps and covers a mixture of scenario planning content, and I also cover a lot of project logistics in the book as well, and they're embedded in the method. We'll cover the steps briefly in this video series, but they are covered in great detail in the book, which is mentioned at the end of the video series. To develop this method, I've drawn on what I think is the best of other expert scenario planners' work, as well as my own experience applying and refining the method as I've taught it to more than 450 executives and students over more than a decade. Like all scenario planning methods, it can challenge you. And like all scenario planning methods, it can also be iterative, which I've indicated by the arrows in this figure. If you follow it closely, the method will produce 4 focused scenarios and unique scenarios that will suggest what you can do now and in future to adapt for whatever positive or negative implications might come from climate change for your organization. Step 1 is a collection of 4 sub-steps to set the agenda, define the focal question and time horizon, and identify key stakeholders. This step will create a platform for you to get your project up and running, get it off the ground. It'll help you to identify who could champion the project. Ideally, that will be the chairman of the board or the CEO. It'll help you to identify who should lead the project, who should be on the team, and also to help you propose a suitable duration and budget for the project. We won't cover that step too much in this exercise, but successful scenario planning projects typically have very broad stakeholder involvement from all parts of the organisation. The overarching point here is to ensure that the project is supported from the top with a champion and a budget, and that your team includes as many executives as is practical, and that the project is inclusive of all parts of the business. I cover this in a lot of detail in the book. In terms of setting the agenda, here are some of the questions you would want to answer to make sure that your project has a great start. The first one is a really obvious one. Why should we undertake scenario planning? Why should we do this? If you can't answer that in a really rigorous way, you're not going to get the budget, you're not going to get the buy-in. Who will champion the project? Who will lead the project, as I mentioned before? Who should be on the team? And what should be the project duration and budget? Scenario planning projects can be as short as, say, 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and as long as 3 or 4 months. With the agenda set, you'll then move on to defining your focal question and the time horizon. You need to find a time horizon that is appropriate for your organization. In the book, I center on a 25-year time horizon. And that's what I'll use for our exercise today. My question today is, how could climate change plausibly affect Local Bank in 25 years, and how should it prepare? Now, Local Bank is a fictitious Boston bank that I use as a case study in the book. And I'm going to use it to take you through today's mini scenario planning exercise. For your part of today's exercise, I've already defined the question and the time horizon for you. Your question is on this slide. How could my career or retirement look 15 years from now? And how should I prepare? The question is already written on your worksheet. If you're younger, then focus on your career. If you're older, focus on your retirement. The last part of step 1 is to identify key stakeholders inside and outside the organization that are relevant to your focal question. These might be suppliers or partners, key customers. That may also be affected by climate change. You can see here that I've listed a few potential stakeholders for Local Bank, and they range from employees to the community and associations like Chambers of Commerce. Now it's your turn. On your worksheet, write down 4 or 5 key stakeholders that are important to your career or your retirement. They might be individuals or organizations. I've listed a few possibilities here just for brainstorming purposes. Pause the video while you do that, write down those stakeholders, and then move on to step 2 with me. Okay, we're ready for step 2. Step 2 is where the bulk of your analytical efforts will occur in a scenario planning project. Since good scenarios depend on the ability of a project team to identify and analyze underlying driving forces that could shape the organization's future. Just to give you an idea, when I was way back at the beginning, when I was introduced to scenario plan, I was a master's student. I actually did scenario planning as one of my assignments. And I guess the semester was about 12 weeks long. I spent 6 weeks on step 2. It's a really big step. Let's start with the first part of step 2, identifying driving forces. Driving forces are typically big overarching trends over which any one organization or person has little to no control. They might be things like the climate. They might be things like the political regime in power. It might be things like certain policies. It might be social movements. Your goal is to identify overarching driving forces that could shape the future at your chosen time horizon. You'll also want to try and establish what the state of the force could be at the time horizon. Usually, you'll start by developing a long list of forces. Here are a few examples of forces that might affect Local Bank. All of these forces are related to climate change, and all of them could affect Local Bank 25 years from now or thereabouts. As you can see, the forces include some that relate to the natural environment. We have temperature change in there, we have precipitation change, extreme weather, but there's also socioeconomic activity like shareholder activism. Policy making is in there, like the development of water or economic policies, and even competitive and industrial activity are there, like climate-related competition or the emergence of public-private partnerships. This is a pretty small list. If you want some resources to help you brainstorm for climate change forces, the appendix of the book contains summaries for a pretty good sample of well-known forces. In those summaries, we also include some information about how they are affecting companies now and how they might affect them 25 years from now. We also have additional summaries that are available for free on my website, which is nadiahaig.com. Let's explore a few of Local Bank's forces so you can get the general idea. Being a bank based in Boston, even a fictitious bank, Local Bank needs to get a good idea of what the state of summer and winter temperatures could be 25 years from now. Analysis done by the City of Boston helps here. The City of Boston has estimated that the number of very hot days could rise quite a bit by 2030 and more by 2070, while the number of very cold winter days could decrease markedly. This will have pros and cons for a local bank. Let's take a look at another force. We already talked in a previous video about how climate change impacts relating to droughts and extreme weather could affect economic policies around the world. For a local bank based in Boston, this could mean things like climate-affected exchange rates and climate-affected interest rates. Sea level rise is another potential force to consider. Since 1901, global mean sea levels have risen by 19 centimetres or about 7.5 inches. In Boston, researchers estimated that sea levels could rise by about 7 inches by 2050 and could be more. The most extreme scenarios go quite a bit higher. But in this image, what you see is the extent of flooding under a moderate sea level rise of about 21 inches. Which could occur sometime between 2050 and 2100. So it's a big time period. As you can see of this map of Boston, which depicts 21 inches of sea level rise and the flooding, the extent of flooding is quite widespread, even for that moderate amount. The other thing that this slide points out is the importance of maps to scenario planning for climate change. For instance, all I would need to do to determine local banks' exposure to sea level rise would be to plot its locations on maps like this one. Maps are a great visual resource for scenario planning for climate change. A final example I'll give for local bank is extreme weather. For those of you that don't know Boston, we get hit with some pretty big storms occasionally, especially winter storms. The City of Boston estimates that by 2060 or about mid-century, more rain will be falling in a shorter period of time. What that means is with each storm, you will get more rain falling. Now that can have an effect on physical infrastructure. It could have an effect on buildings that might be local bank branches or could be properties over which local bank is holding a mortgage. It could also affect infrastructure in the city. Flooding could occur. So you're getting the idea now of the kind of research that you could do to understand how climate change forces might affect an organisation. As you're doing your research, you would start to make a list of potential driving forces like this one. It would normally have more on it than this one, but for the purposes of this exercise, I've included trends relating to precipitation, infrastructure adaptation, extreme weather, sea level rise, and economic policies. They could affect local bank out to its 25-year time horizon. As you can see, I've also given a very basic description of each driver and how it could affect local bank. For instance, for economic policies, I've written that it could affect exchange rates and interest rates. Now it's your turn. Think about your career or your retirement. Take 4 or 5 minutes or more if you need to jot down on your worksheet or fill in your worksheet if you have the Word version, at least 4 driving forces. I've given you a few ideas on the side of this slide. Pause the video until you're done, and then we'll move on to filling in the cells on the right of the spreadsheet. You don't need to do those just yet. From here, we're going to rate each force according to uncertainty and potential impact. Let's start with uncertainty, since this is what often trips people up. Now, if we were doing risk management, we'd be rating probability and impact of each force. But since we're doing scenario planning, we are using uncertainty instead of probability. Uncertainty is different from probability, but people sometimes confuse the two. Using a scale of 1 to 10, scenario planners will rate the degree of uncertainty surrounding each force in relation to the organisation and the chosen time horizon. For example, if research indicates that the driver certainly will not impact the organisation at the time horizon, then you would allocate a very low number for uncertainty. If your research indicates that the force definitely will affect the organisation at the time horizon, you would also apply a rating that is very low. If research gives no indication of the potential state of the force at the time horizon, then you would assign a much higher uncertainty, up to 10, because you can't establish the state of it with any degree of confidence. Okay, does that make sense? The small diagram at the bottom of this slide should help you with determining uncertainty ratings. Once you've done the uncertainty ratings, you need to move on to the impact ratings. This is a bit more straightforward. It's also out of 10, it's the same scale. But what you're doing now is you're assuming that it is impacting the organisation, because you need to think, okay, if it did impact the organisation, how big would that impact be? You need to just put in ratings that you can defend, that you can explain and defend. So I'm going to show you now what might be the ratings for local bank. Here are the ratings I've developed for local bank. You may agree or disagree with any of the numbers, but they're really just there for the purposes of this exercise, so you get the picture. I'm going to talk you through the economic policies one. You can pause the video and read through the others if you wish. Looking at the economic policies one, my thinking is that since droughts and extreme weather may or may not affect interest rates and exchange rates, and if they did, that impact will be indirect, that means there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's difficult to think about what the state of that driver might be 25 years from now. But there seems to be rigorous research suggesting that droughts and extreme weather will be in play, or could very well be in play. So that tempers my thinking a little bit. Now, for these reasons, I've put uncertainty at a 6 out of 10. You might argue it should be higher, and that's fine. I think if the impact were to occur, the impact will be fairly big. So I've put the impact rating at a 9, since it could send customers going to other banks, it could cause mortgagees to fall behind on their payments, or have other detrimental impacts on local bank. Now it's your turn. Go through your list of forces and rate each of them for uncertainty and impact. Pause here while you do it, and then restart once you're ready to go to ranking your forces. After you've rated uncertainty and impact, completing the ranking is a straightforward process of multiplying uncertainty and impact to arrive at the total for each driving force, and then sorting the list according to highest scores first. While ranking is a simple mathematical process, it is usually a step in scenario planning that challenges people's assumptions, because people usually have preconceived ideas about what might rise to the top of the ranking. It's important at this point to let the numbers speak for themselves, since a great deal of research will have gone into generating them. Ranking the forces puts them all on an even playing field. And what you've done, or what you will have done by doing this, is to identify those forces that are in combination most uncertain and most impactful. So again, it's important to make sure you let the numbers speak for themselves. As you can see here, I've multiplied column A by column B for each force, and then I've ranked the forces according to the final column. In this example for local bank, you'll see that economic policies has risen to the top, followed by precipitation. Here are the ratings I've developed for local bank. You may agree or disagree with any of the numbers, but they're really just there for the purposes of this exercise, so you get the picture. I'm going to talk you through the economic policies one. You can pause the video and read through the others if you wish. Looking at the economic policies one, my thinking is that since droughts and extreme weather may or may not affect interest rates and exchange rates, and if they did, that impact will be indirect, that means there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's difficult to think about what the state of that driver might be 25 years from now. But there seems to be rigorous research suggesting that droughts and extreme weather will be in play, or could very well be in play. So that tempers my thinking a little bit. Now, for these reasons, I've put uncertainty at a 6 out of 10. You might argue it should be higher, and that's fine. I think if the impact were to occur, the impact will be fairly big. So I've put the impact rating at a 9, since it could send customers going to other banks, it could cause mortgagees to fall behind on their payments, or have other detrimental impacts on local bank. Now it's your turn. Go through your list of forces and rate each of them for uncertainty and impact. Pause here while you do it, and then restart once you're ready to go to ranking your forces. Now, do the same for yourself. Pause the video and multiply column A by column B for each of the forces on your worksheet, then rank them from highest to lowest. Then return when you've done it. Did anything surprise you? Often something rises to the top or sinks to the bottom that is really unexpected. As I mentioned, this is usually the first point at which scenario planning can challenge your assumptions. But remember, what you've identified here are forces that are in combination most uncertain and most impactful, that could have a pretty big impact on your career or your retirement. Let's review what you have here now that you've done your ranking. You have a ranked list of forces. You have first and second ranking drivers that will become the scaffolding for your scenarios. And you have a list of lower ranking drivers that will flesh out the details of each scenario. You've already done a lot of work. For today's exercise, we're going to concentrate mostly on the top 2 forces so that you can get a general idea. But know that if we were doing scenario planning for real, those lower ranking forces would not be ignored. We process them and handle them in one way or another. Writing good scenarios is not a trivial job, but in today's exercise, we'll be able to cover the bare bones of them pretty quickly. We're going to create 4 scenarios from the 2 highest ranking forces. You would write a pretty short narrative for each scenario, as if you had traveled into the future and are reporting back to the present. I've given you a couple of guidelines here about what good scenarios look like. They're well researched and full of detail typically. They are plausible and surprising. This is really important. If your scenarios seem plausible but are surprising, that's a great sign. You're right on track. Good scenarios are relevant to their audience. Today, the audience is you. You need to make sure that you assume all your scenarios are equally probable. Remember, the forces that are the scaffolding for them, they are the top 2 ranking forces that in combination are most uncertain and most impactful for you. Here are the brief scenarios I've developed for local bank. Plotting the scenarios on a matrix like this one is very common practice because it helps to keep the scenarios distinct from each other and it helps to display them really well visually. As you can see, local bank's two highest ranking forces, which are economic policies and precipitation, are the differentiating storylines of each scenario. In a scenario planning project, we'd put in lots of other details, including some of the lower ranking forces. Let me talk you through each one. In the top right-hand corner, we have scenario 1. Here, and this is where we start to impose probability on the forces. You need to assume that both the highest and second highest ranking forces are in play. So here, both economic policies and precipitation change have material impacts for local bank. Scenario 2, in the bottom left corner, here you're assuming neither of them are in play. Now this force usually looks most like business as usual, but it doesn't make it any easier to write. So scenario 2 assumes neither economic policies nor precipitation have material impacts for local bank. In scenario 3 and 4, we're going to toggle them. So scenario 3, you will assume that precipitation change is in play, but not economic policies. And in scenario 4, you will assume that economic policies are in play and are impacting the organisation, but not precipitation change. Within these 4 scenarios, there will be a worst and best case scenario. If both of your top ranking drivers are negative, would have negative impacts on the organisation, then scenario 1 will likely be your worst case scenario. Okay, time for your turn. In the next section of the worksheet, jot down the basic storyline of each of your scenarios. Pause the video here until you're done. Okay, so you're done. Did anything get you thinking there? People will often feel a little confronted at this stage because their worst case scenario is probably one of those 4 scenarios. An important quality of scenario planning is to prompt thinking about both bad and good scenarios, because then we can prepare for whatever unfolds. If this happened for you, you are right on track. Now, after laying all that groundwork, it's actually time to get to some strategizing. The 4th and final step in this process is identifying warning signals, outlining a broad strategy that will prepare the organisation for whatever scenario might unfold, and assessing your experiences with the process. Let's dive in. Identifying warning signals is an important process of detecting what the organisation should track now and into the future, so it can determine which scenario might be unfolding as time proceeds. It might also help you indicate that none of your 4 scenarios are happening, but something else is occurring. Basic warning signals are those relating to each driver. That's a very obvious thing, such as the amount of sea level rise. You might want to track that. Or for local bank, the implementation of economic policy. Lots of different drivers. Others may not be as important, but you would still want to track them anyway, because they might indicate certain fringe trends coming over the horizon. On this slide, I've included a few things that local bank might consider monitoring so that it can track how the future seems to be shaping up for it. Now it's your turn again. Take a few minutes to jot down any warning signals that you think are important to your career or your retirement. Use your worksheet. I've given you a few ideas on this list. Note that I've included sea level rise on this list. Reason is the next time you look to buy property, be sure to check local flood maps and make sure it's clear of even the worst flooding. Sometimes these worst floods are called 500-year floods. If you can make sure that any property you own is well clear of even that 500-year flood, it'll give you a better buffer for the future. So pause this video until you're done. Then we'll continue to the thing that most people are waiting for, which is developing a strategic plan. I have a lot of people tell me that scenario planning unexpectedly slows down their strategizing. That's true, and it's a good thing. We shouldn't be rushing into strategies. We certainly shouldn't be rushing into long-term strategies. At this point in a real project at least, you will have a solid foundation of research and also broad stakeholder involvement from around the organisation. That will help you develop rigorous and innovative strategies that will also help you have better timing because you'll be monitoring those warning signals we talked about. So this step is all about developing strategies. You would develop a broad strategy, including multiple strategic options that the organisation could use to build up resilience regardless of which scenario might unfold. A strategy will usually include things like plans to change current strategies, make policy changes. It could be plans for deeper research in an area that this scenario planning project has not been able to work in fully. Maybe there are outstanding questions that need deeper research. It'll also provide details of no regrets actions that it makes sense to take regardless of what scenario might unfold. It will also provide details of actions that are more contingent, that you would only take in future depending on what the warning signals were telling you. On this slide, I've listed some of the things that a local bank might consider doing. Okay, so now it's your turn again. Aside from monitoring warning signals, what else could you do now or in future? In particular, give some thought to what you might do to prevent your worst case scenario from occurring. Pause the video while you work on that and rejoin me for the final part of today's exercise. Finally, to provide a feedback loop that will help build in-house scenario planning capabilities, the final step is to assess your scenario planning project to understand its effectiveness and to improve it for next time. Local bank scenario team members would assess what they learned from the project and what they can do better next time. Things like, what was the satisfaction of people working in the project? What did they learn from it? And how has it affected company performance, or how could it affect company performance? So this is your final task for this session. Take a moment to jot down on your worksheet answers to these questions. What was the most important thing you learned from this mini scenario planning exercise? What was the most challenging part of the exercise? And will you change anything about your career or retirement planning based on what you learned? And if so, what? The last step is to set a date to repeat the scenario planning project. Scenario planning should not be a once-only project, but done regularly. In fact, it's best if it's incorporated into the general strategic management process. Even if it's not done every year, you want to do it every few years. And that brings us to the end of the method. If you followed the exercise, which has forced you to think about uncomfortable things about your career or your retirement, including your worst case scenario, you've also developed a set of strategies, or at least a few thoughts, that will help you to manage whatever ultimately unfolds for you. I'm hoping that you will feel some kind of sense of accomplishment. It is a really significant thing that you've done, so congratulations. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in learning more about how climate change might affect your organization and what you can do about it, you can go to Amazon and buy the book, or you can keep watching and keep in touch as more videos will be uploaded and developed on this site. Thanks a lot.